Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. On behalf of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Princeton University, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Summer Institute. Sorry for the delay in getting started. We have some live streaming issues we're working on. We're still using the system we had this morning. Hopefully it'll be a little bit better, and hopefully by after lunch, we'll switch to a new system which will work even better. So we're having slow incremental progress. What I'm going to talk about today is ethics. I should say that this is not a subject that I ever thought I would deal with as a quantitative social scientist. I thought, oh, ethics are easy. You just send your application to the IRB, and then they approve it, and then you can do it. And as I've discovered, for people doing computational social science, it is much more complicated than that. And I've seen colleagues make mistakes that they did not intend to make. And I've seen a lot of people struggle with these issues as they try to do their research. And so I think as computational social scientists, this is one of the challenges that comes with the opportunities that we are blessed with. So why should we care about ethics? I think we should care about ethics because we're all nice people, I hope, and we want to do the right thing. But there are a couple different ways sometimes I hear people motivate an interest in ethics. One is a fear-based reason, which is, one, we don't want to get in trouble with our own research, right? Nobody wants to commit an ethical mistake. And second, we should be worried about ethics because we as a field don't want people in our field doing really crazy things, doing really bad things that would harm lots of people and harm our fields. However, I'd like to focus on some hope-based reasons. And so let me explain what I mean by this, which is that I think there is a lot of research that is ethical and beneficial to society that could be being done today that is not currently being done because there is so much ambiguity and uncertainty around the ethics of this research. And so if we can develop norms and rules and procedures in the field that we all agree on and that we get other stakeholders to agree to, then I think we'll be able to do much more research. And then finally, we just have no choice. So everyone in this room is probably much closer to an ethical problem than they would like to realize. And that's what happens when you work as a computational social scientist. So one way I like to think about this is in the past, what we could do has often been the main limitation, and increasingly I think it will be what we should do. So our capabilities are really, really growing, and we will have to decide how we choose to exercise those capabilities. And I think it will become increasingly central to what we think about as computational social scientists. So after the lectures today and the activities, I hope you'll be able to design ethically thoughtful research and also explain your decisions to others. And those are two different skills, both of which are very important. And particularly the ability to talk about ethics, I think is very important if the field is going to make progress and if you personally are going to be able to do research that's complicated. Just saying, I did this because it was allowed under the rules is not a great way to communicate what you're doing. And so hopefully this better communication will help us all move forward faster and also be more open about the choices we've made. So oftentimes when I'm doing statistical research, I have to make certain trade-offs and choices, and then I write, I made these choices. This estimator is good at this thing, but not so good at this other thing. And then other people in the future can see the choices that I've made and hopefully do better. And in ethics, we don't have that same process where people are usually not so open about how they tried to weigh the ethical issues. And so we are all struggling to make difficult decisions without a lot of help from each other. OK, so for today, I'm going to repeat some of what's in bit by bit. But going forward, I'm going to assume that you've read bit by bit, and I'm going to assume that you all at the partner locations have read it. That was part of the pre-arrival material. OK, so I think there are kind of three broad ways that people can think about how to approach ethics of research. And so let me also put a little scope condition on what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to develop procedures that companies or governments could use to oversee research. I'm not trying to develop techniques that could be used to police what researchers are doing. What I'm trying to do is help well-meaning researchers do what they're doing in a more responsible way. So there's not going to be anything in here about police or oversight or anything like that. It's mainly designed to help you. So one approach is the one that I see is most common in the social sciences, which I would call the rules-based approach. And this, in the US, is related to following the IRB. So for people, researchers who are not in the US we have these institutional review boards that are run in each university. They're following rules and regulations that are set up by the US government that govern all research that's funded by US government. And so many universities then choose to use these regulations to cover all research that is done at that university. And so the way it would work is, let's say I want to do some web scraping. Maybe I might have to apply to the IRB. It's kind of ambiguous because the IRB rules were created before web scraping. Then I would send it to the IRB, and then they would review it, and then they would make a decision. Or maybe they would ask questions, and we would go through this process, and then eventually I would get an approval from the IRB, and that is all supposed to happen before the research begins. Now, the rules-based approach, one of the problems with it is that these rules were written a long time ago and don't really cover very well some of the things that we can do now. They were also created at a time where they focused on a different set of problems than some that we encounter, and so I'll talk more about some of the challenges with this rules-based approach. But I think a final one is basically as the capabilities change, they change faster than the rules. And so anyone who's going to be doing new things is going to struggle to go with a rules-based approach. And also, it's not very good for explaining what you're doing to other people. So if a journalist calls you and says, why did you do that study? You said, my IRB approved it. That is something, but that's maybe not a full explanation. The second approach that I've seen is an ad hoc approach. This I see more in computer science, where they don't have the same rules-based approach that we have in the social sciences. And so there you have people who I think are well-meaning and trying to figure out what to do, but there is not a coherent framework that everyone follows. Different people do different things, and this is incredibly difficult to do well, because you, as a researcher, are supposed to come up with your own ethical system and weigh things and communicate that to others and convince people that your system is coherent. It's incredibly difficult. And so what I'm going to advocate for is a principles-based approach, which is that we try to follow certain principles. We use those principles to help see the trade-offs in a bunch of the research that we could do. And we use those principles to help communicate with others about the trade-offs that we've made. And the good news is that we do not have to make up these principles ourselves. They have already been made up for us. So before I get into this principles-based approach, I want to start with 3 examples of research that you might have heard of to just make it a little bit more concrete, the kinds of things that we're talking about. So emotional contagion was a project that was done as a collaboration between researchers at Facebook and researchers at Cornell. I'm going to try to describe these as accurately as I can. In the book, I write them very accurately, more accurately than I can as I'm talking. So it's a collaboration between researchers at Facebook and Cornell, and they ran experiments where they randomly adjusted the emotional content of people's news feeds. So for example, some people were put into a condition where posts that had words that had positive emotional valences, like happy and fun, were randomly blocked. Other people were put into a condition of negativity reduced. So posts that had negative words were randomly blocked. And then the researchers studied the subsequent emotional valence of words that those people posted. And there was also a control condition. And so the idea was they were interested in to what extent people's the emotions of people's peers influences their own emotions. And so that study happened. It was published in PNAS. it generated a lot of concern about the ethics of this process. It led the journal PNAS to publish an editorial expression of concern. And that is one example of a study that happened that there's discussion about. Another is Taste, Ties, and Time. This is one where, not an experiment, but an observational study. Researchers, with the permission of their university and with the permission of Facebook, acquired data from the Facebook pages of all of a entering class of students at that university and followed this over time. They also got data from the university and merged them together so they could look at things like what dorms people lived in and when they became friends, things like this. Then they de-identified the data and made it available to other researchers. And then people quickly discovered that it was possible to re-identify the university and possibly re-identify some of the people. So these issues don't just arise in experiments, they can also arise in observational data. And then a last study is called Encore. So in this study, the researchers wanted to develop a system to measure online censorship. So in many parts of the world, not every website is accessible. Some governments explicitly block certain websites from certain, and so the thing that these researchers wanted is a way of measuring what websites were being censored from which countries all over the world. And so what they did is they created a little piece of code that someone could install into a website. So for example, let's imagine we had put this code into the Summer Institute website. And then let's imagine that Chris visits the Summer Institute website from his home in North Carolina. That little snippet of code goes onto Chris's machine. That is then executed by Chris's browser. That little snippet of code tries to reach a website that is potentially blocked. So that could be a website of a social movement organization that is censored in some countries. If that website returns, Chris's website gets the return message and then sends that back to the researchers. So basically the researchers have taken the task of trying a bunch of websites and they've distributed it to millions of people all over the world. So in engineering terms, it's a very elegant solution to this problem. But what it means is that these users in different countries, their browsers are pinging these potentially censored websites without their consent or awareness. So those are three examples where I think all of these researchers were well-meaning in what they were doing. They were doing thoughtful, interesting, important research. That research led very quickly into some very complicated ethical issues. And none of these research studies are very well fit into the frameworks that we currently have. So for example, the Encore researchers, they approached their IRB and said, we want to do this. And the IRB said, that's not human subjects research, according to the definition of human subjects research, so you can do it, even though it potentially had human harming potential. Okay, so those are three examples. I would ask you all to think of other examples, but we are behind time now because of the technical issues. So over break or over lunch, we can have tables where people talk about some examples from their own work or examples from their friends' work. So what's the problem with a lot of these studies? Why is this so hard? So I think one is increasing power. So we can now, let me explain what I mean by power. We can observe the behavior of millions of people without their consent and without their awareness. We can now enroll millions of people in experiments without their consent and without their awareness. And this is especially true if we collaborate with companies and governments, which many computational social scientists do. This is something that was not possible before. As social scientists, we just did not have this kind of power. Then on top of that, we have these inconsistent and overlapping rules, norms, and expectations. It's not clear how we should exercise this power. So for example, in emotional contagion, it was a collaboration between researchers at Facebook and researchers at Cornell. So whose rules govern that project? Should it be governed by the Facebook rules? Should it be governed by the Cornell rules? Both? What if those rules conflict? Unclear. Encore operated all over the world. There are very different rules and norms and expectations about what people can and should be doing all over the world. So it's really hard to know what is the right thing to do because all these environments are mashed together. So it used to be in the old world, old style, it was very clear where research began and where research ended. So like you brought students into your Psych 101 experiment. They stepped in that room, that was research. They stepped out of that room, the research was over. Or you call someone on the phone and you ask them a bunch of questions. Research begins, research ends. The context is very clear. And increasingly, we're seeing research much more mixed into everyday life. And this, in some ways, is great. So this is one of the things people love about field experiments, is that you get to see an experiment in someone's real context. But then once you start mixing these contexts, which rules apply is less clear. So the argument that I'm going to make is that increasingly what we have to do is we have to move away from an approach based on the rules to the principles that led to those rules. And then sometimes those principles themselves will be not sufficiently general to help us reason. And then we have to go even more general to the ethical frameworks that help lead to those principles that help lead to those rules. Okay? And so now I'm going to walk through what those principles are. So there are 4 principles that I'm going to talk about. The first 3 come from the Belmont Report, which was a report that was commissioned by the US government around 1970 in response to the Tuskegee syphilis study and a number of other research ethics failures. And they got together and they tried to decide a set of principles that we should follow as researchers. And I want to point out they worked on this for years. They produced a 20-page report, which I think is great. And then they also have 2 appendices, each of which are about 700 pages. So a lot of times I hear researchers say, like, let's make some ethical principles for data science. And I'm like, that's great, but like, you're not going to be able to do that like on a Slack channel. Like, this is like a really serious, hard thing to do. These people worked very hard to do it. And I think it would be a great idea for us to try to build on what they've done rather than try to start from scratch. Then the 4th principle, respect for law and public interest, that comes from something called the Menlo Report, which was commissioned actually by the Department of Homeland Security when computer science researchers, particularly computer security researchers, started encountering some of the ethical challenges that arise in digital age research. So they had things like computer security researchers were breaking into botnets and taking them over. And like that was good for security research, but then they started thinking like, do we want researchers to be doing this kind of stuff? And so what rules can we come up with or principles that researchers should follow? So the first principle is respect for persons. And this really boils down to the idea that participants decide, not you. So often I hear researchers say, well, I wouldn't have a problem if someone did that to me. And that's great. Then you can consent to be in that study. But the idea is that really we want to respect the autonomy of people. And this means giving them the choice about whether to participate or not. So the process of informed consent often comes from the principle of respect for persons. So the way I like to think about it, informed consent is not a principle. It's a process that tries to honor this principle. Okay? So the second principle from the Belmont Report is beneficence. And so beneficence is about minimizing risks, maximizing benefits, and then deciding. So I want to talk about a couple steps of this. There's often in a piece of research, there are technical decisions that you can make. So for example, in emotional contagion, how exactly do you do the block? How exactly are the posts knocked out of the page? Like what are the technical things that you've done there? Or have you excluded people that might be especially susceptible to having a bad reaction to this? Do you have a procedure in place if there are adverse events or a system to collect these? These are more or less technical things about how you would design something correctly. Then there is a totally different step, which is even if you have done all the technical things correctly, should you still do it? And in my experience, people who are very good at one of these decisions are not often the best at the other decision. So I served on the IRB here at Princeton. And just to be clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of the IRB. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. But one of the experiences that I saw there that I thought was fascinating was that the IRB requires non-researchers to be on the IRB. And so we had a minister on the IRB. And it was just fascinating that he was often not able to participate in the discussions about how the data was encrypted and all these things. But then when it was like, okay, should we really do this, he often had very different and interesting things to say. And so as much as possible, I want you all to think that there are these two things happening. One is technical and one is non-technical, and both of them need to be done well. So that's beneficence. A third principle is justice. So justice involves thinking about the burdens and benefits of research. And so here I want to just acknowledge that the research ethics failures that we've seen in the past have almost always involved disadvantaged people. So there are poorly educated and disenfranchised citizens. So the Tuskegee study took place in the backdrop of Jim Crow in the South in the US. There's a very bad history of doing research on prisoners who don't really have the option of not participating. Mentally disabled children, old and debilitated hospital patients. Each of these is a real thing that happened to real people that was done by scientists who thought they were doing something important, and the people who often suffered were those who were least able to protect themselves. And so we should think as researchers we have an extra responsibility to protect people who do not have that capability, and also that we should make sure that the burdens of research do not fall on one group and the benefits go to a different group. So in the history of medical ethics, there was a situation where these studies would be done on poor people, and then the benefits of that medical knowledge would only be accessible to rich people. Right? Like, that's not a good system. So one other thing about justice, though, there's a debate in the literature about how we should interpret justice, because one way of thinking about justice is we would not want these people to be involved in research at all, people who are potentially disadvantaged or disenfranchised. But then those people don't necessarily get to benefit from what comes out of research. So for example, there's a debate about children and pregnant medical research. Children and pregnant women, should they be in medical research or not? It adds to the risks. But then if they're excluded from research, we don't often have the knowledge we would need about these populations. So justice is tricky. Like, we want to protect certain people, but we don't necessarily want to freeze them out of the research process. And then respect for law and public interest. This comes from the Menlo report. It has two main elements. The first is compliance. This mainly means following what is allowed, the law, which can be complicated in the case of Encore, for example. I think it's pretty much impossible to figure out what is allowed in every country in the world. And then second is transparency-based accountability. This is about being open about what you're doing. So if you're doing a research project and if you don't want your name on it or wouldn't want that to appear on the front page of the New York Times, then that is probably a good sign that you should reconsider what you're doing. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it means you should really have a serious thought if you want to do something in secret. And so one of the arguments is researchers should be much more open about what they're doing so that everyone can understand, and researchers themselves can be subject to the criticism that they may help lead to better practice. Okay? So let's take an example and try to think about how these principles might play out with a problem that many of you might have experienced. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but what is terms of service on websites? Okay, I see some people nodding. So very briefly, websites have a bunch of information available on them. It is accessible to you as a person, and you may want to use that information for your research. So you will learn, some of you may already know how to write a web scraper to pull down that information, or you will learn about it very soon, tomorrow. But often these websites have terms of service agreements, which sometimes explicitly don't allow that, and other times are kind of ambiguous about how to think about that. So I want to give one example. This is a project by Solar et al. About detecting and monitoring international border personalization on online maps. So let me just read this very quickly. Maps have long played a central role in enabling people to conceptualize and navigate the world around them. However, maps also encode the worldview of their creators. And then I'll skip. And basically what they do is they say, we want to know if Google and Bing are showing different maps to different people. And we think that's important so that everyone can know what these companies are doing. So to address this problem, we present MapWatch, our system for detecting and cataloging personalization in international borders. Our system continuously crawls all map tiles from Google and Bing, leverages crowd workers to identify border personalization. In this paper, we present the architecture for MapWatch and analyze instances of border personalization on Google and Bing. So you can imagine why they would want to do this. Some of you are already thinking about how you would do the crawling and how you would send these to the crowd workers to do this. So here's an example of the border between Russia and Ukraine around Crimea. So if you, at the time of this research, if you access from Russia, you would see one place for the border. If you access from Ukraine, you would see a different place. And if you access from everywhere else in the world, you would see a third thing. So they talk very explicitly in the paper about the ethics of what they're doing. So they say many web platforms discourage all automated crawling outside the API, and even within the API, a platform may prohibit research in its terms of service. We agree with 57, that's a different paper that they wrote, that non-commercial research for the public good that deals with issues of societal importance must be able to access public web resources for research purposes as long as the automated processes do not produce an unreasonable load. This was our guiding philosophy in this research design. So they are very clear about what they are doing and why they are doing it, and that's what they've done. So if you are thinking about breaking the terms of service or being gray with the terms of service, you should think, am I willing to write a paragraph like this in my paper? And if the answer is no, then I think it's a good thing to think about. So this is also, there are also questions about this related to compliance. So is it okay, what if it is actually against the law to do this? What should you do? So there is now a lawsuit. One of the authors in this paper, the ACLU is helping them sue the US government about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So I'm not a lawyer. I can't speak to the legality of this. So there are legal questions, but even if it is legal, there's still the question of whether this is something that you might want to do or not. So if you are facing a situation like this, I think one thing that you could do, in addition to talking about it over lunch, you could check out a talk from the Summer Institute in 2018 by Dean Freelon called Surviving the Post-API Age. And so basically what he argues is this x-axis here is time. And then he said we were in an age where lots of websites gave people access to data through APIs. That is now going away. And increasingly, websites don't want to enable API access. And so we're moving into this post-API age. And so his talk is really about how researchers should deal with this situation. And he has a term for this, going off the grid, which is like includes all different kinds of gray ways of getting access to data. And he says sometimes you may have to go off the grid, or sometimes you may want to go off the grid, but these are some things that you would need to think about. So one is you might lose access during your research. So let's say you build a scraper and it's up and running, and then the company detects the scraper and shuts you down. So that could happen. You might have a struggle to have your research funded. You might struggle to talk about it, and you might struggle to publish it. So I, for example, have reviewed a grant that involved someone who was going off the grid. And the funder of the grant was very wary of funding research that involved potentially going off the grid. Let's put it that way. So that's tricky. You may, if people ask you, how did you get your data? That may be an awkward conversation. And when you try to publish your research, people may raise questions, which again would be very awkward and difficult. And then also, you might not be able to share your research with others afterwards. So there's an increasing movement towards open and reproducible research. If you acquire your research data through these off-the-grid methods, it may be difficult for you to share your data with others. So none of this is to say that you should never go off the grid. Like, I think this example from MapWatch is a good one, where they think there is a very clear reason, compelling public interest. They were very clear that they did not want to put an excess load on the companies, for example. But the question is, how often when people go off to the grid, do they have as strong of an ethical justification as the people from MapWatch? Oh, this is the last thing, is that you might not just mess it up for yourself, but you might mess it up for everyone else. Just keep that in mind. So those are 4 principles: respect for persons, beneficence, justice, respect for law, and public interest. Often these principles come into conflict. So there's, and what we have to do is try to balance these. And there's no one right way to balance them. It varies from case to case. So for those of you who are used to like algorithms, there's like some kinds of algorithms that need more RAM. There's some kinds that run faster. There's some kinds that need more disk space. And those are just different dimensions that you can trade off. And you wouldn't say, oh, you should always maximize the amount of disk space that you need or whatever. Like, depends on what you're doing. And so, and how harsh the trade-offs are. And that all varies from project to project. So I've often found it very helpful to think along these 4 dimensions, think about the trade-offs that I'm making, and then try to communicate with others what those trade-offs are. Sometimes, though, it's helpful to take even a step back from these principles to 2 broader ethical schools. So one is, most ethical arguments that I hear in computational social science are really one of these 2 arguments dressed up a little bit. So consequentialism is most associated with people like John Stuart Mill, and it's about thinking about the consequences of an action. So it's a, in the end, this action will do more benefit than harm, so we should do it. Focus on the consequences. Deontology, most associated with Kant, much more associated with the means. So even if the ends are very good, if that involves a bad means to get to those good ends, then we shouldn't do it. So it's often about trading off between means and ends. I've often seen scientists are very focused on ends, and also often not the best at calculating the benefits and risks. Because they, almost by definition, if you're a scientist, you have to believe that your research is really important, or you wouldn't be able to actually sustain all the effort to do it. And like, realistically, your research is probably not as important as you think it is. I mean, this applies to me too, just to be totally honest, right? There's a bit of self-delusion involved in the whole process that we all participate in. And so if you're the one who's balancing the risks and benefits, and you're deluded in what you think the benefits are, you're not maybe in the best position to be making these decisions. That's why I think having third-party oversight is really helpful, and having just third-party colleagues, peers, friends, people who are not researchers, your parents, like all of these people, talk to them about it too. So what I often see is sometimes you will see a computational social scientist taking a very consequentialist position, and you will see a privacy advocate taking a very deontological position. And then they struggle to communicate with each other. So someone says, oh, there's no harm if I take all this data off Twitter. It's not a big deal, and think about the value of the research. And then someone else will say, but did those people give you permission to use the data? And then the first person will say, yeah, but think of the benefits. And like, this is not going to win. It's like you're like arguing with the person in the wrong frame. You will never convince anyone if you're not in the right frame. And so if you're in one of these discussions, try to make sure you notice which frame the other person is in, and just take a minute in that person's frame. That person may not be in the right frame. I'm not saying that one of these is better than the other. But I'm saying if you want to come to some kind of consensus, it's very helpful to make sure that you're in the same frame as the person that you're talking to. I also want to point out both of these ethical frameworks are flawed. Like, there are examples of situations that we know these are problematic. So for example, let's say we all believe in focusing on the consequences. So that's the most important thing, maximizing benefits, minimizing harms. So then we would all agree that we should take Chris over to the hospital and cut him up and take all of his beautiful, healthy organs and give them to lots of people. And we could save like 6 people's lives, right? Think about how much benefit that would be, right? So like, obviously, we're not going to take Chris to the hospital and cut him up. So this is an example of kind of consequentialism taken to its extreme leads to really weird things. Deontology taken to its extreme. Let's imagine that Chris has planted a ticking time bomb inside of Princeton University, and if he won't tell us the location, this bomb is going to go off and everyone on campus will be killed. And let's imagine, would we lie to Chris to get him to reveal the location of this bomb? So a very strict deontologist might say, oh no, we can't lie. Lying is not appropriate. But I think many of us would agree, in this situation, lying might be okay. And so both of these can lead to really silly outcomes. And so no matter which frame we're in, we should be able to shift, and we should also be able to think about the limitations of that frame. Okay? So just to give a quick question about the consequentialism deontology frame, make sure we can all quickly detect which frame someone is in. This is an argument that was made about emotional contagion. So even if it is true that the risks for the Facebook experiment were low, and even if in hindsight the results were judged to be useful, there is an important principle at stake here that must be upheld. In the same way that stealing is stealing, no matter what amounts are involved, so we all have the right not to be experimented on without our knowledge and consent, whatever the nature of this research. So I'm going to ask you whether this is a consequentialist argument or a deontological argument, and then I want you to take a second, think about it, then talk to your neighbor for like 5 seconds, and then I'm going to ask everyone to vote. So this is a structure that I use a lot. It's called think, pair, share. Think, pair, share. This is an easy one to start with. We'll do this more later as the summer institute goes. So is this a consequentialist or a deontological argument? Now talk to your neighbor. And remember that the live stream is on. Okay, very good. I hear lots of good discussion. Let's come back together. So on the count of 3, show me on your fingers, is it consequentialism or deontology? Ready? 3, 2, 1, go. It's a very deontological argument. So the argument is saying, let's ignore the ends, let's focus on the means. So is saying to this person, but think about the benefits of that research, is that going to be an effective argument? No, definitely not. Okay, so that's a little bit about this schematic and how sometimes we have to move higher up in the chain of abstraction to communicate effectively and think carefully about what we're doing. Applying these 4 principles can be difficult, and so I want to talk about 4 areas where I see these kinds of problems happen a lot. But before moving on to those 4 areas, so these are principles, ethical principles. Then there are kind of problems that you will encounter in your research. So we're going to go through those problems that you'll encounter and try to use the principles to help think about them. So before I do that, are there any questions from here in the room or on the live stream? Yes?
One question that may be on the border of these principles is to maximize the profit of somebody else.
Yes. This is a great question. I'm going to repeat it for the live stream. The question is, how do you think about the ethics of your choice of research problem? And that was not included here at all. And I think, to be honest, this is one of the things I struggle with more and more. I'll talk a little bit about it in the next set of slides. But I think the ethical traditions in the social sciences don't do a good job of addressing these questions. And I think it's one that comes up more as researchers have more and more power. So if you're doing something that will be a published paper that's not really going to impact that many people's lives, then it's maybe not as much of a concern. But if you are working inside of a deployed system that reaches billions of people, I think this has to be a much bigger area of focus. And it's something that I'll talk a little bit about next. I think there's two things to think about, though. One is, what is the intended use of your research? So is the intended use of your research something that you're comfortable with? That would be a base question for me. And then the second is, what are the possible unintended uses of your research? So you may be developing research that is designed to maximize persuasion of people, to help them do some good behavior, like wash their hands more before they work with a patient. And this research about persuasion can be used to persuade people to do other things. And so I hope we'll be better at thinking about the directly intended uses of our research, but also potentially the unintended secondary uses of our research. And that is a much harder problem. Yeah?
It's more like a practical question
Yeah.
about web scraping. So what's the difference between terms of service and robots? Like, should we follow like how they interact? Some sites doesn't have like the terms of service, just the
Yeah.
so
So I've never done web scraping. So are there people here who the question, let me repeat the question. How do we deal with terms of service versus robots.txt? Does anyone here have an answer to that?
I ignore them both.
Okay, so one answer is to ignore them both. What if they're in conflict? Does anyone else? So one of the things that I will suggest is each at the meals, what we often do is we have people can propose topics. And if you're interested in that topic, you can sit at that table and just chat about it. So the one person is the convener. They have no intellectual responsibility other than just to sit at a table. And then everyone else can find that person if they want to sit at that table. And so if people are interested in talking about how to think about these issues with web scraping, I would propose that we have a table for that at lunch. Because the other thing is, some of the conversations might be better if the live stream was not on. So oh, no age. Okay.
A lot of Tiabas in Brazil have the age. So.
Okay. All right. So if you're interested in talking about that at lunch, sit with Tiago, and you all can have a nice conversation about that. Okay? Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. So just to repeat the question for people on the live stream, what if you want to do an experiment that involves a person interacting with an AI system or a bot or some other non-human thing, but you want to study how they're interacting with that non-human thing? If you don't, some IRBs want you to tell the people very clearly before it starts, but then the experiment can't be effective. And so there, I think the principles that are at stake here are a trade-off between respect for persons and beneficence. Right? So you want to respect the other person's autonomy in deciding how to participate. But at the same time, doing a certain thing to give them full information at the beginning would cause problems for the value of the research. And so it sounds like the solution that you've come up with is kind of delayed information. You sort of inform them more at the end. And there is a tradition of this in psychology a lot, where you give people some information before, and then you give people more information at the end. And then I think an important thing is to then track whether that would actually change people's opinions at the beginning. So if you find that you tell them at the end, and no one is upset at the end that they were interacting with a bot, then that's probably a sign that they would not have objected at the beginning if they had known. But if at the end you tell them they're interacting with a bot and they get very upset, that's a sign that you're then not really respecting their autonomy. So I think you can still think about mechanisms to try to think about these principles. And try to still do the right thing and get the research done. But it sounds like you've come to a reasonable hybrid. Okay, Felix, and then Tom.
I was wondering if you're researching the financial research.
It's a big question. So I think it goes back to, I think, well, it raises a couple issues. So the question is about what about researchers at companies who run experiments or other things. So one thing is that companies can create IRBs if they want, or IRB-like entities. So Microsoft Research has an IRB-like entity. Facebook has an IRB-like entity. Other companies may have them as well. It's in the Belmont report, they make a distinction between research and everyday business practice. And so I think that distinction made sense. And they said the Belmont report only applies to research, everyday business practice, not so much. That was maybe a reasonable thing to do when the everyday business practice was medicine, where there is a very strong ethical framework already in place. And at the time, a lot of the crazier stuff was happening in the research part of medicine, not in the treatment part of medicine. At companies now, they have less strong of this same tradition that doctors have, let's say. Companies are thinking about how to solve this problem. I know a lot of companies that want to try to solve this problem, but it's very difficult. And I don't know how to solve that. Is that a topic people would like to talk about at a lunch table? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Yes? Yeah.
If companies basically do a lot of this research, a lot of them are being used actually against the consumers, and they don't need to publish their work, why should we limit the scientists who actually do a lot of this research to help sometimes, but we limit them or even ban them from doing this research? And this makes some asymmetric.
Yes, no, this is a great point. Let me repeat this. So if people at companies are doing this research, often in adversarial relationship with their customers, and they don't publish this research, then a lot of bad stuff is happening and no one is learning from it. And so why should academics follow a different set of rules that makes it harder for them to do research, even though the research that they're doing is more likely to be in the public interest and more likely to be shared with others? Is that the? Yeah. So I am very sympathetic to that argument, but I also think there's another side to it, which is that we don't want to be, I think as an academic, I personally do not want to be in a race to the bottom with every company out there. So like, let's take, I don't mean to pick on a casino company, adult gaming or whatever they call it now. Let's imagine that you owned a casino. You might be doing research that is very adversarial to your customers, and they may be doing that research, but that doesn't mean that I want to do that. And so I've found that society gives a lot of benefits to academics in general. Like I spent a year on sabbatical at Microsoft Research, and so I'd meet people and they would ask me like, oh, what do you do? And I would say, oh, I work at Microsoft. And the reaction that I got when I say, oh, I'm a professor, and oh, I work at Microsoft, completely different. Like there are all kinds of good things that society gives to academics. And I think part of that comes from people believing that academics follow some higher standard, believe in searching for truth and sharing knowledge and all of these great things that the academic system can be sometimes. And so I think that if we want, it's a little bit like rabbis. Like rabbis, they're supposed to follow a higher, they're supposed to be better than other people, even if it's not against the rules for them to spit or like say bad words and things. So that is the kind of flip side to this, is that if as academics we can follow a higher standard, I think that can help us in other ways. But that is definitely a conversation for lunch as well. So we're going to do experiments in companies and governments, because governments can do this stuff too. Who would like to convene this table? Felix? All right. Okay. We got one question from the live stream, and then we're going to move on to the next set of talks.
Okay, yeah, I've got 6 in queue.
Oh, all right. We'll get 3 questions from the live stream, and then we'll move on. But I'll give shorter answers this time.
Okay.
Here.
All right. So the first one coming from RTI is, if we offer monetary incentives or experiments, how should we figure out the optimal amount to offer?
This is a great question. There's a lot of research in bioethics about how to figure out the right amount of compensation. So there's like a practical question of how much you should give, but I'm assuming this is a question about the ethics of it. So you don't want to give so much that it becomes coercive, and you don't want to give too little to not honor the participant's time. So how you would do that is kind of a case-by-case thing, and I would definitely recommend, there's a bunch of people who have thought more carefully about it.
All right, this next one's from Chicago. Many of the contentious pre-IRB era studies have quote-unquote helped advance science in some ways and are taken to be correct knowledge. However, they can't be replicated anymore to see if their findings still stand. So how do we get around this issue of replication given the replicability crisis in some social science fields today?
Yeah, the replication crisis or open and reproducible research, yeah, so the question was, there are some studies that have happened in the past that are considered reliable science but are considered ethically problematic, and we can never replicate them. So how should we think about this in terms of open and reproducible research or the replication crisis? And I would say, let's just focus on the stuff that we can replicate. Like, we have plenty of problems to worry about with making our research more open and more reproducible. And I'm not sure that we need to or want to go back to some of the stuff that was done in the past. Just because it was done once doesn't mean we should do it again.
All right, one more. All right, from Boston. What are some good examples of informed consent processes when collecting large-scale data, say through Facebook or Twitter?
Yeah, this is a great question. So one of the things is that the traditional way that we think about informed consent is very difficult to do at a much bigger scale. So, and especially as studies become more complicated. So you could say, well, why don't you just write down a form that explains all of the ways the data is going to be used, and it just becomes incredibly complicated and very, very, very difficult. So it is very hard to be both informed and consent. Like, it's just really hard. And so what are some ways to do this? So in bit by bit, I have some examples of things that you can do if informed consent in the way that we think about it with a piece of paper that you sign is not possible. So I think one is being very open about what you're doing the entire time. So even if you can't tell each individual person, you should try as much as possible to make it public what you're doing so that people can ask questions and people can opt out if they want. So one thing that we think about informed consent is often expressed as something about respect for persons, but there is also a beneficence element to informed consent, which is that if your research is particularly dangerous to certain people, they should be able to avoid it. For example, if someone has like a liver disease, you wouldn't want to put them in a trial of a drug that like is damaging to people's livers. So in a social science setting, if people are maybe members of a particularly stigmatized group in a certain country where that is very dangerous, you would want to make sure that those people have the chance to avoid your research, not just out of respect for persons, but also out of trying to minimize harm. So another thing that you can do, I think also one of the purposes of informed consent is actually to keep researchers honest in terms of getting you to think very carefully about what are all the risks and benefits of your study. And so even if you cannot give this to each individual person, I think it is a very useful activity for you to go through and write that document up for yourself and post it online. And that will force you to have good thought process. That will help you try to balance your research, hopefully, in a more ethical way. So those are some examples, and there's more in bit by bit. So thank you all for the questions. Now we're going to move on to the next set of slides, and then we'll break at 12:30 for lunch. 12:30 East Coast US time, and whatever time it is wherever you are.